was positive in the sense of resetting and reflecting on what we were doing and who we were as a restaurant and what we want to be when we reopen. So I guess the thought process started to change, and I feel like, you know what, maybe it is time to just sort of look at what we're doing and what's working, what's not working. So it just became very reflective.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. A few episodes ago, Pasquale Trimboli explained that restaurants are an extension of one's personality. For many that get the chance to open their own restaurant, they not only put their life savings on the line, but every sense of themselves goes into the business too. It's often a vision of how they like to break bread, and they're sharing it with the community. But the pandemic forced everyone to rethink their vision, and the slow crawl back to that vision is proving challenging. Ibrahim Kasif is the owner of one of Australia's best Turkish restaurants, Stanbuli. Ibrahim, how are you?
Hi, Huck. Yeah, I'm well, thanks.
Mate, you've got a pretty amazing restaurant in Enmore in Sydney that really changed the discussion on Turkish food in Australia, which we'll get to. But I just wonder, can you start by telling us what that sort of early stages of the pandemic was like for you and the impact that it had?
Well, with the pandemic, I think that, like a lot of restaurants, we were starting to see signs. I mean, you know, there was obviously a lot of talk about this virus going around at the back end of last year. And you could see the numbers. Usually we come out of the gates pretty strong at the start of the year. It's always been a positive time of year for us, fresh after Christmas, New Year, and then it just felt a little bit deflated. It didn't quite have the same numbers coming through, and you could see that there was a little bit of a drop, which got me thinking, whether was it us, was it like our pattern, or had it reached its peak and it was dropping? Like you start sort of thinking about what's happening and questioning what's happening, and then you know, because it is natural to sort of blame I guess the external factors. But then I think as the conversation heated up about this thing becoming a pandemic, we started to see the numbers dropping with reservations and a lot more cancellations, which hits you pretty hard because you're prepping up and you're getting ready for it, and you're putting a lot of effort into making sure that you've got an interesting menu and all of the above, and then all of a sudden you're just getting all these cancellations. And I think the week where the speculation was really building up in the media with what was going to happen, you know, we saw probably a 50 to 60% drop, and then it just became carnage after that. We were just down probably. I mean, we weren't sure what to do. We weren't even sure when they started making announcements for restrictions and how diners were allowed to come in. We just got, you know, it was quite dire. We weren't really sure what we're waiting on. We're sort of waiting for announcements and waiting to see what had happened, but what will happen. But it ended up being, you know, the operation dropped probably 70 to 80% the week of. So yeah, it was pretty tough. But I guess the only thing that was reassuring was everyone was in the same boat. I mean, everyone. You look across, and you know, there are a lot of restaurants. Like everyone was sort of just feeling the same thing. So we're just sort of in the waiting game, to be honest.
What did you do in those early days to adapt and you know, survive? Really, I mean, this is a business that you created a couple of years ago, and really your vision of Turkish cuisine. You know, what have you done in this period?
Well, the first thing we did was we sort of jokingly said that we'll just turn into a kebab shop and just flip it around and just become a takeaway, which, you know, the cuisine sort of lends itself, that association for it to be a takeaway style cuisine anyway. So I felt like, okay, this will be a simple enough game plan to switch things around and do simpler things, which I guess coincided with, which is what we did. We just sort of made things very simple, and we went about doing what I jokingly say around the restaurant is the dreaded the dips, which I don't never championed. I've never had the word dips on my menu when I try and avoid that sort of interpretation of the cuisine, like pide and dips and like mixed grills and stuff, skewered meat. That wasn't me, because I was adamant I wanted to showcase another side of the cuisine that was a little bit more interesting than that. So then I sort of was like, okay, we just have to give the people what they want type of attitude and do that. So we were doing that as takeaway. But it was quite interesting during that period, which was great. I mean, we had a lot of support. People were our regulars and people that knew Stanbuli. They were really supportive and very grateful for how wonderful they were to come and support us in the early weeks of doing takeaway. And it was just a very simple version of what we were doing. So I took away all the sort of the composition salads that I did that was very Turkish, and the sort of simpler sort of ingredients that I championed, like, whether it was, dishes based on beans, or whether it was dishes based on peppers or eggplants. And I did dips, so yogurt-based sort of things that were pureed and a lot simpler, made the bread simpler and all that kind of thing. But, while we were doing it, and we were actually having fun in the kitchen, and, it was good because I could keep a lot of my kitchen staff on because they'd been with me for a while, and we had a lot of government assistance with that, and my restaurant manager was with me the whole time. So we were in it together in that sense. But it was great because it was positive in the sense of resetting and reflecting on what we were doing and who we were as a restaurant, and what we want to be when we reopen. So I guess the thought process started to change, and I started thinking, you know what, this isn't as offensive as I thought it was, even though I was always like anti sort of dip plates and things on skewers. I feel like, you know what, maybe it is time to just sort of look at what we're doing and what's working, what's not working. So it just became very reflective, I think. And, we ticked along. Obviously, it's not the best business model to have just doing sort of takeaway, especially when you are competing with kebab shops and every other takeaway incarnation out there. So we were just sort of doing us as best as we could. And it just got thinking about what's going to happen in the prep now, which is, now that we can open up for 10 to, we went up to 10, then to 30. Well, we can do 30 now, square meterage. So just, lots of reflection, and we just started thinking this would be a great opportunity to open the doors and have another crack at a new version of Stanbuli, which is what sort of happened.
What was it like in that period? Because I know we've discussed it before, and you wanted to change the perceptions of Turkish cuisine as just a takeaway sort of kebab shop, and your hand was forced to change. What was the process in those couple of weeks like when you realised you had to do takeaway, but also you realised that, changing the model isn't necessarily a bad idea in the end?
I think we're just sort of learning on the spot and making decisions, as you're thinking about it, which has been a good lesson learned from, I think, my time at Porteño. I used to see, Elvis do it all the time, just sort of thinking on his feet and making decisions that, you make a decision and then you reassess if it doesn't quite work. And that I sort of got a lot of confidence from that era when I worked with them. And I just thought, I'm going to make some changes and I'm just going to see how they go and what the response is, and then be fluid enough to sort of change things and tweak things as we go. I think, my idea of restaurants has always been romantic in the sense of a place that's convivial and a place that is welcoming and the food's just delicious. It doesn't have to be a culinary epiphany. It doesn't have to be something where you're like, wow, well, how did they do that? That doesn't necessarily, for me, correlate with a great restaurant experience. For me, I think of all the great restaurants I like to eat in, and sometimes it just comes down to, that's just really delicious. It may not be technically perfect, but it's just bloody delicious to eat. And that was always my brief. It's always been my brief with my food. It just has to be, I believe it has to taste yummy and enjoy it. And people can come and relate to it in a sense of, this is just really yummy. I can come back and eat this. And it's not, I'm not confused with what's going on. And, even, the sad thing for me was when I thought about it, maybe Stanbuli started heading that way. Maybe people were getting confused with what I was doing and what they thought, because people have got an idea of what Turkish food is, and then all of a sudden they're like, I don't get this. What's he trying to do here, or whatever? And that some people do get it, which is great, and then other people were like, yeah, it was good, but not good enough to come back. So it's just been good to sort of break things down, and we're really excited about the new version of Stanbuli because I think there's only one dish that survived the old version of Stanbuli, which is the crushed eggplant salad. But yeah, everything just sort of went on the chopping block, and even things like just putting melon and cheese out, I've just had to rethink what that means, because we had people by the end going, how do I eat this? And you're like, man, it's melon and cheese. Like, is it really that hard to work out how to eat that? But okay, if it's that complicated, then maybe that was like the straw that broke the camel's back for me. I was like, okay, if you don't know how to eat that, then I have to really think about what I'm doing here. So I guess that was the process, just really thinking about everything, and just redoing things and having a new crack at it, I guess.
What is Turkish food to you?
Turkish food for me is, it's such an interesting cuisine. For me, it's a cuisine that's still evolving. It's got incredible history, incredible repertoire of dishes and ingredients. For me, I've always said, to understand food, you need to understand history. And the history of Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, is phenomenal. And what that history is, and the geography, the borders, and who the people are, where they came from. I mean, the first thing is, to answer that question, is like Turkish people are people that come from northern China, and we think of, they're not Middle Easterners. They're the nomads that came from China, from northern China, and the cuisine itself is influenced from the northern Chinese, and it traveled through the guts of the Middle East, known as the Spice Trail, and along the way it is just like morphs into this incredibly interesting story, and you can see the influences in all the countries along the way, because they've all got versions of what mainland Turkey has, and it's just sort of left its influence along the way. So I think of Turkish food as an incredible can of worms. Like, where do you start to talk about it? It's a cuisine that's still evolving. I mean, tomatoes are a huge part of the cuisine, for example, and that's only been, I think it's just about to tick over 100 years in the last bit of history that tomatoes have been part of the cuisine.
Wow.
So it's still evolving. It's still evolving as a cuisine. And then every region is incredibly unique, and its influence is phenomenal. I mean, again, it's like, I'll give you a couple of random examples, which I use a lot. Like, let's use dumplings or pasta. Who created pasta? Is it the Chinese or is it the Italians? I mean, you've got noodles. You've got one of the most ancient cuisines ever, Chinese cuisine, versus the European cuisine, which came from a lot of influence. I mean, look at kitchens. Where did kitchens come from? Again, you have to understand history, and the Ottomans were one of the first, if not the first, to champion the closed kitchen. And the French would be the first, if you understand French cuisine, where they learnt a lot of the things through that Ottoman era and period. It's really it's a can of worms, Huck. Like, I don't even know where to start with it. You need a whole series on it, mate. It is an absolute monster of a subject to talk about. But again, you have to understand the history. But for me, Turkish cuisine is vibrant. To short answer it, it's vibrant. It's incredibly huge range of when I think of Turkish cuisine, it's all about vegetables, and it's all about pulses and seafood, and just delicious flavors. Simple. simple flavors, but really delicious. And yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that because I'll keep going.
Well, let's look at your history. It might take a whole series to go over Turkish history with cuisine, but let's look at yours. Your grandparents came to Australia with one of the first waves of migration from that region. What was it like for them when they first got here, and how did they cope? Creating their own food from their homeland.
Yep. So my background is Turkish Cypriot. So Cyprus has got its own very unique history. It's a divided island. It's Cyprus is known as to the world as Cyprus, which is a Greek, I guess known as a Greek sort of island or country. But if you were to speak to a Turkish Cypriot, it would be a very different argument. It's an island that was occupied by both cultures, Turkish and Greek, who lived harmoniously for a long time. There's always going to be natural sort of tensions between two cultures, but they did live harmoniously for a long time. And again, history would suggest how things get ruined. It's usually come the British and make things very complicated. But the British were ruling Cyprus at the time. And my grandparents were both British subjects, so they had British passports, and it was for my grandfather, late 1940s, and there was opportunity with a lot of politics building up on the island between the Greeks and the Turks. There was an opportunity to leave the island, and my grandfather came out as one of the first wave of Turkish Cypriots as British subjects to come out to Australia. There were a lot of options. You could have gone to the UK, you could have gone to the US, but they chose to come over to Australia. And my grandfather was quite happy with what he saw here, so he went back, found my grandmother, and then they came out here to settle. And by then it was the mid to late 50s, and they were part of a very special sort of group of people that got to come out, because the people they came out with, I mean, they left a lot of people behind. A lot of them would have left their parents, and they would have left their siblings, because everyone was off doing their own thing. And whoever they came out with became lifelong friends, family friends, and very important people in their lives. But when they did come out in the 50s, it was Australia was a white Australia policy. There was a white Australia, which meant they weren't used to seeing too many foreigners, too many Europeans. So they were confronted by a very racist Australia as well. Their stories were quite hard because, there was a level of low tolerance and acceptance for people that were coming into the country. But they had the attitude, like most immigrants, was to knuckle down and work very hard. And that wave of people that did come out in the 40s and 50s, whether they were Greek or Turkish Cypriots or any type of immigrant that would have come out in that period, they would have been extremely hardworking because it was survival. They only had one way to survive. There wasn't any government handouts. There wasn't anything that you think of, that the generations that have forged the way for us today, and how fortunate we are with a lot of the government policies that are in place now. I mean, there was nothing like that for them. They had to work very, very hard, and they did. And they contributed. They worked hard. They paid their taxes. They did everything they could. They had children. They had a family, and they did their thing. But in the same sense, which I think is where your question is going, is they tried really hard as well to remember where they came from and keep on to their culture, which was Turkish or Turkish Cypriot, and a lot of the food. My grandmother would, she only knew how to cook one type of cuisine, and that was Turkish food. So all of a sudden, she's in a foreign country and she's trying to find ingredients that don't exist. And the simplest of ingredients would be, I think, something like olive oil, which we take very much for granted now. But we're not talking about, one of my favorite catchphrases from the modern chef is, 20, 30 years ago, we didn't know what this was. Well, 20, 30 years ago, we're talking about, 20 years ago, we're just talking about 2000 still, so it's not that long ago. And I'm pretty sure in the 2000s we knew what soy sauce was and balsamic was and olive oil was. So I think our time frame's a bit off. I'm talking 50, 60 years ago, there was no olive oil. My grandmother said that she happened to stumble across a chemist, and in the medicine section there was olive oil, and she couldn't believe it. She was like, "What's this doing here?" So she was buying olive oil, and she was using it to cook with, not for medicine, whatever I don't know what they were. I mean, she could probably tell the story better than I can, but I think it was for skin ailment of some sort, for the rashes or something, or if you had like stomach pain, to rub olive oil on your tummy, you know. So she was cooking with it. So it was as simple as like finding olive oil, which was quite unbelievable. And she had to try source ingredients. Luckily, the cuisine is very vegetable based. So, finding things like, I guess, spinach and, tomatoes and eggplants and stuff was probably a little bit easier. Probably not as easy as now, but, pulses were always going to be challenging. But thanks to the Greek immigrants and the Italians that were already out here, that they were sort of already paving the way with bringing ingredients out. So, that's how she held on to the culture.
What was it like for you growing up eating food that was, Western food, and growing up in schools here and then going home to having, really beautiful Turkish cuisine as well, and having that balance? Do you have any stories from those days?
I'm nothing too dramatic. And I think the first time it sort of hit me that I had Turkish breakfasts are a pretty big deal. If you've ever heard of what goes on for breakfast in Turkish culture, whether it's mainland Turkey or Cyprus, I didn't realize how big it was until school camp. And I was like in line. I realized then and there that I was in all sorts of trouble in the line when I was used to having lots of halloumi and olives and tomatoes and cucumbers, like cheeses and jams for breakfast every morning with breads. And I'm in line, and I'm in the rice bubbles line, and I'm like, oh, here we go. I don't know what's going on now. I thought I'm in all sorts of trouble because I've never eaten rice bubbles in my life, and I'm on school camp, and I can feel like the anxiety just like building up in my body because I knew I was going to be caught out. I thought, oh, they're gonna catch me out now. Like, I have no idea what I'm about to do. So I'm watching the guy in front of me put a couple of spoonfuls of rice bubbles, and then he put sugar on it, and I was like, okay, I'm just sort of copying this guy. I felt like a Mr. Bean episode, I'm just sort of like trying to mirror this guy next to me. And I was like, oh, God, what am I eating? I'm like pouring milk on, and my stomach was turning. I was like, oh, God, this is not what I'm used to for breakfast. So I think that's when it sort of hit me. So that was probably about 8 or 9 years old on school camp that I realised things are a bit different at home than what the average Joe was eating outside. But that was pretty cool nonetheless, learning about that. And I guess you realise at school lunches when, kids are polishing off Vegemite sandwiches and you're eating stuffed vegetables for leftovers from last night's dinner, that there was very different things going on at home compared to everyone else. So, I think lucky enough in the sense that I'm second generation. So my dad was born here, and he was influenced a lot from I guess Australians and their cuisine, or whatever that cuisine is, which is a loose term, I guess, in the 50s. But I think it's better defined now than what it was in the 50s. Growing up in the 60s and seeing how people ate. So there was a little bit of exposure. And then when my grandmother, she worked in a hospital, and she used to help in the kitchen, and she learnt about roasting joints of meat, whether it's lamb or beef, and making gravy and roasting vegetables. So she saw all that on hand when she was working at the hospital, which was pretty cool. So there was a little bit of exposure. So I wasn't totally foreign to other cuisines growing up. But, you come home and definitely have Turkish-based food, whether it's, braised pulses of some sort, whether it's white beans or eating a black-eyed bean salad, or, braised meat with okra or green beans. That was very much normal food for me. And, yeah, when you're a kid, you don't really realize, I think, until you're older, that again, people are doing things a bit differently at home.
How did it feel when you, took all of your rich history and the food that you grew up with, and you had the chance to open your own restaurant with Stanbuli? What's it been like having your own identity with the Turkish cuisine?
It's been fun. It's been really liberating, I think. You go through phases. Like when I first, again, even when I started cooking, which was in the early 2000s, I out of school and got into an apprenticeship. I wasn't, that the fashion in food, I think in the early 2000s was mod Oz food, I guess, modern Oz, and which was again a very loose term of a crossover of European and French influences and Italian influences. But then, by the mid 2000s and later 2000s, I felt like Asian cuisines, whether it was Thai or Southeast Asian is probably the best way to describe it, was very fashionable. So I went through a bit of confusion with what I felt like I wanted to do with food. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with food until I'd finished my apprenticeship, and I always had this idea that maybe Mod Oz or I had to learn Southeast Asian, to the point where I actually went to Thailand and did a bit of work in a hotel just to sort of learn how to cook Thai food, because I thought that's maybe where the food was going. And you think of the great restaurants in the 2000s, whether it was Rockpool or you'd hear of the great stories of David Thompson's influence in Thai food, and you think of Kylie Kwong's Billy Kwong and all that. There was so many amazing restaurants that had that Asian slant to it. So I thought that's what had to happen. But it wasn't until I never gave the credit to Turkish food until I travelled as a young adult around Europe and went to Turkey and spent some time in Turkey. And here I am eating Turkish food, which I didn't give it enough credit to. Even as a young chef, I never thought about it as a way of cooking professionally. It was like a penny drop moment when I'm eating the cuisine that seems to have been so familiar to me and I grew up eating, and it was just, here it is in front of me, and it wasn't dips and it wasn't things on skewers. It was just like the most incredible version, which was just like little plates of really interesting vegetables and seafood and grilled meats, again, that weren't on skewers. And I'm just sitting there and I'm eating, and it's just like a penny drop moment where you're like, wow, I'm eating stuffed mussels, I'm eating melon and cheese, and I'm like, oh, wow, this is just incredible. I'm eating a fish sandwich, down the foreshore of the Bosphorus, and it's all there. The answers are just in front of me, and I'm like, this is what I want to be doing. This is what I should be doing. I can't believe it's taken me, well, it felt like at that moment, it's taken me so long. And then I just sort of, that became it. I started formulating that and what I wanted to do with Turkish food. And then you just start seeing, I've always likened, like, funnily enough, when people say, oh, what do you want to do? Like, how do you see your Turkish food? I always liken to what Kylie Kwong has done with what she used to do with Billy Kwong. It was like just such a beautiful interpretation of Chinese food. And I was like, that was actually the greatest influence. And then, I was really fortunate enough to work for Ben and Elvis, and you think of their sort of that Latin South American influence they have in their food, and it's just like beautiful flavors. Is it like the most technical food? No, it's just like really bang on flavors and really just delicious food to eat, and that's the most inspiring. That's like, wow. That's I could easily slant that with how I want Turkish food to be. So they were always my benchmark. Sort of inspirations. I used to work for Peter Canistas as well, who at the time had Amiga in the early 2000s, and it just won like Best New Restaurant, 2 hats, all that. And he was doing modern Greek, and it was like a really fancy version of Greek, but he still had that. He was still grounded by familiarity. Like when you ate something, you're like, whoa, that's like the best version of beans I've ever had, or the best version of eggplant I've ever had. He still had that almost, that really subtle humbleness to his food, which I really just admired a lot. So it just felt like the answers were always just like staring me in the face. And then when I was working, I guess at Porteño, I sort of said to Elvis, "Man, this is going to be my last stop. I think I just have to have a go at doing Turkish food, and have a crack at it." And he was just like, "Yeah, man, let's just do it. Like, why don't you? We'll help you do it, and like let's just back yourself and have a go. If you believe in it, just rip in and see what happens." So that was just again very liberating to have that sort of backing, that support behind me. So yeah, when I got to open the doors and I was just doing stuffed mussels and everything that I felt like is real Turkish food, like fish sandwiches and eating grilled fish, whether it's sardines or fried little babunya or stuffed mussels, as I said numerous times, crushed eggplant salad, really interesting compositions like olive salads and salads just made from fried peppers or whatever, just like things that is quintessential Turkish. But again, people wouldn't know it because they just know the kebab shop colors of dips, whether it's all these hybrids of Turkish food, and not very real. So that's what people sort of knew, and I wasn't out to challenge it to be a smartass. I was just challenging it in the sense of there's actually a lot more to the cuisine than meets the eye. So yeah, that was very liberating.
Now, you've recently opened the doors and you're pushing forward. What's the version of Stanbuli that's come to fruition through the pandemic? I know you've got limited numbers, but what are we going to see, and what have you been doing?
I think now that we've opened the doors, I just wanted to really, I guess, rethink how I was doing things. And I think the brief it has to be fun, and it has to be a version where people feel like a lot more. I don't know. I just wanted to make it comfortable again for people to get, and not feel like, oh, this is just complicated, or I'm not getting why there's so many little plates of meze coming out. I don't know how to eat this, and so I've dumbed it down a bit. Still being true to me and making things. The brief, like I said, just has to be delicious for me, and just looking at again another version of the cuisine that. There's so many different versions of the cuisine to explore, and I guess I'm inspired by modern Istanbul, I guess, which is I guess quite dynamic and cosmopolitan. And you think of things like, again, I'm re-exploring the fish sandwich. I'm re-exploring things like over there right now, they've got this really weird sort of street food called soggy hamburgers. Which are just like these over-steamed hamburgers that people are just sort of like frothing on. It's just a street food that even you would have seen it maybe on when Anthony Bourdain did his episode in Istanbul. He was polishing off a soggy hamburger. So we're doing we're doing exactly that version. A bit more inspired by home cooking. This version of Stanbuli. So like we're doing a very Turkish Cypriot style. Pasta dish, which is just like noodles cooked in chicken broth, and you boil basically you just have to boil a chicken, use that broth to boil your pasta, grate lots of halloumi and dried ricotta over the top, and crisp up the chicken that you've just poached and serve it. It's just like a really peasant dish, which is just super delicious. So we're doing, I don't know, our new version is just keeping the brief as everything really delicious, but I think just a bit more dynamic, I guess is the best way to describe it. And just inspired by all sorts of the versions of the cuisine, not just the meyhanes, which used to do meze.
Well, mate, I can't wait to experience the new Stanbuli for myself. As you know, I've always been a big fan, especially of the fish sandwiches sitting at the bar. Keep in touch. I really appreciate you sharing your story with us today, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we share the stories of Australia's hospo community, suppliers and producers in search of hope during this pandemic. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.